Tahra Hoops, you're in good traffic. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really happy to have you on the show. Was listening to FY Pod, a Bulwark property, a few weeks ago, and you were on the show, and was really excited. First of all, because a lot of the guests on there are video first creators, we'll call them, lots of TikTokers and things like that, and it was cool to have someone on there from Gen Z that is doing, we'll call a lost art in tweeting and writing as their primary modes of delivering messages. It was great to learn about you on there and to dive into some of your work afterwards. So yeah, thanks for being here today, and great work on that podcast, talking to two people that I love listening to a lot. So you hung with them very well, and it was a great conversation.
Yeah, no, they are very both quick-witted people, and it was an interesting podcast for me because, as you mentioned, I am not a video creator of sort. I have a background in policy and so forth, but just being like a Zoomer who is extremely online, I find myself working with social media quite a bit, so I could see why they wanted to have me on.
No, yeah, it was a great conversation. I'm sure we'll touch on some of the similar stuff today. For anyone in our audience that's maybe a little unfamiliar with what you do, and we'll get into the progress chamber and what you all are up to as well. But is there anything like day to day about your job that you think people should know in terms of like who you are, that helps kind of give a good understanding of like what leads you to being here on the show today, chatting about housing and ancillary issues such as that?
Yeah, I joke that my job is pretty unique within the policy sector. So anytime I speak to like college students or so forth, they ask like how to get a career to mine. And I joke that I am like one of the products of like posting to policy pipeline, just because I've always been very active on Twitter. And that's actually how I was reached out to my current position. It was already a job that I saw beforehand, but I was like, okay, I'm taking this as the sign to do so. But I also joke that a crazy person kind of does this job because you have to really like policy and really like current events,
Mhm.
but also go into every subject that you do because a lot of my focus is on cost of living. And that hits every little niche of the world, even in ways you would not expect it, with the same curiosity as you first found it, because that is the best way to communicate to people. I also started my career in more of a policy comms space because I felt like there's always such a large like dissemination gaps from how like policy goes on to paper before it goes on to the public.
Mhm.
So a lot of it is like rapid response, reading quite a bit. I always have like YouTube TV playing and I'll jump from different TV channels. I do try and watch Fox News, which is not good for my mental health and my moral belief in the world, but it's important to stay apprised of everything going on across the aisle.
Yes, it sounds like you're a good person to go to if you're unsure about what different people are saying about any sort of issue, which I think is a valuable person to have in a friend. Yeah, I would say I used to be that person more. Have tried for my sanity, as you mentioned, to maybe shrink my diet in terms of what I consume a little bit. But there are definitely benefits both ways, especially if it's what you're doing a lot for your work. I am curious, like getting into that a bit. So when I got into your Twitter a little bit after learning about you, and seeing how much, just the volume of how much you post, but also the range of subjects, right? Like it all relates back to, like you said, cost of living, economics, housing, but it's very wide. Would you consider yourself a generalist? Is that something that you strive to be in terms of your learning? I know you talk about sources that you learn from, but also like topically, are there days where you're researching something, you're like, wait, this has nothing to do with what I set out to learn about today, but it's interestingly informing my work and thus my commentary on a conversation?
I think it's important that you note that I've been trying to read older literature, like
Okay.
started the like 1900s, like going back to theory. Almost, I feel like I'm 26. I was a 2020 undergraduate, and only finished my master's a couple years ago. My master's is more quantitative. Undergrad, because it was political science, is more theory based. But I feel like I'm losing a lot of the insights I had when I read more theory. So I find myself reading more of like political philosophy and seeing how that can relate to current policies now. And I try not to be a generalist. If anything, I just have terrible ADHD. If I see something that I just like would like to comment on, it just goes out there. But it is back to the fact that the cost of living has to do with so much of the world that you might not even think about. I would think immigration is a perfect example right now. We know the current ICE raids happening in LA and across the country. Brad Lander was just arrested by ICE just an hour ago, which is entertaining to think about. And that's an important part of the economy that people don't think about. Immigrants are a net positive for the economy. They are the reason our construction industry is the way that it is. To deport them would ruin our housing crisis as it is and only exacerbate that. So it's finding little similarities and how I can connect it back to the overall core issue is like, how are these little impacts like going to infect like the average person on their day to day when they go to buy a house one day, when they go drive a car and see gas prices, when they look at groceries and so forth.
Yeah, something you just said, I want to zoom in for a sec. You mentioned that, as these things are happening, say with immigration or any issue that affects an industry like construction, which thus affects outcomes and data pertaining to housing availability and affordability and the like. So I feel like a lot of times when you talk to someone who is an analyst, right, in a space like econ, you're talking about looking at things in retrospect
Mhm.
naturally, because you have to collect data, you have to make meaning of it, you have to do all the things that you know very well. What I think is interesting is that a lot of these both policy implications day to day, but also just kind of sociological things that happen have a direct impact, obviously, on these things, but they're hard to make a data backed argument about in the moment because
Mhm.
they're just now happening. I guess what I'm getting at is, how do you balance looking at things that maybe, a laggard by a year or two versus like, this happened 5 minutes ago. I'm trying to make the case that this has a direct impact on what's going to come out in the data in a year from now. But yeah, you don't have the data right now, if
Mhm.
that makes sense. Like, that to me is, I struggle with that in a different capacity, but with the show, when it's like a city votes something down, or a bond, or whatever the case may be, and it's like, I'm trying to convince people that this is a, maybe not even convince them, I'm trying to portray some argument that perhaps that was not a smart decision. But if it's like a new one of its kind initiative, there might not be data from a previous effort that supports what I'm saying. So it
Mhm.
becomes like a trust me, bro type of thing. And like, as a person who has a podcast, like, I'm very cognizant about not becoming that person. But it is interesting because I think like the other side of these political issues will have that quick knee jerk reaction, regardless a lot of times of the information and data. And so we feel a responsibility to also have a reaction quickly. But I would imagine someone like yourself is also careful about what the data suggests and the lack of data that might be out there when something is happening. So just curious about what that balance is like for you as someone on the front lines of that.
Yeah, I would say policy communication has rapidly changed in the world of like digital advocacy because people are shouting things out at record speeds. Even the vice president himself and the president are constantly pointing out things that contradict policies that they are implementing. So it becomes very convoluted of how you can react. Am I going to wait for the White House to put out some official statement, and then that's going to be 2 days from now? That's years in a news cycle, and now we're on to something else completely. And I think like tariffs might be the best example of this because he is very quick to implement something and take it back. And for we won't have the data to know what exactly is happening because he is not following anything through. But what we are seeing are like the Home Builders Association came out today and said like tariffs are going to add to our construction costs. Like this is something that is going to happen slowly but surely. And because he continues to take it there, take it back, and so forth, it adds to a level of uncertainty. So even the aspect of the president putting that out into the world, like businesses and investors are responding to that, and that is policy movement in itself. But you make a good point to say like there is like some people on like the far right of like Twitter who will go out there and say like Trump will say something immediately, this is good for us, this is great. And you have people on the Democratic side of things, especially elected leaders, who almost want to say, like, let's wait until we have all the information, like, let's sit on our hands. And then once our comms team and staff team will bring us all the messaging points and data, then we'll go out there and have a statement. And you're not going to win in the digital realm like this because by the time you get something out there, like I said, it's already old news. So it's a balance of, and it's something I always tell myself, if something's too crazy to me online, is it too crazy to believe because it's not believable, or is it too crazy because this is something we can be discussing? So checking your sources is always a big one, which is incredibly difficult. online because there's so many fake bots out there and so forth. But going back and checking with different news sites, if other people are also writing on this, trustworthy sites, there's a lot of economic commentators that I follow and trust, who I know are always like going to steer you right and act in good faith. But making sure I'm not saying something just for the need to commentate and have an opinion.
I see. I see. So there's things that you practice maybe some restraint on that you
Yeah.
might have a personal. That's, I mean, that is helpful probably for your, time management as well, since you couldn't possibly chat about everything. I am curious, like, as I think about your background and getting into the work that you alluded to earlier in terms of how you got here, like when you went to school to kind of get a background on policy and such, were you imagining that housing would be the centerpiece issue of what you'd be dealing with in your kind of day-to-day work, or was it that something that is kind of bubbled to the top as you've continued to get into your career here?
Yeah, so like I said, I graduated undergrad 2020. So my undergraduate time was from 2016 to 2020. It was Trump's first term. So the entire decade of my voting experience has only been voting against Donald Trump. And something I noticed, I was originally a political science major, but I add public policy onto it because I realized we were so hyper partisan to the point where I didn't think anyone was ever getting anything done. It was frustrating me, and I saw how that bled into policy itself. And I also found something very interesting in how it was correlating to how younger people were reacting to politics, where we were so much more involved than ever. Like voter turnout since Trump has been in the picture is incredibly high, but it's because a large part of people have been voting in opposition, except for the last election, because young people kind of went to the right a little bit. That's besides the point. So I just always found it funny how we were relating to politics, policy, and culture all at the same time, and how it was impacting our societal, like even like our interpersonal relationships. I found like a lot of people were taking this to such a moral point where our parents never did. Certainly my parents never did. I am first generation. My parents are immigrants. They didn't have the privilege to care about politics like I did because I'm a US citizen. I didn't have to worry about if I was going to even be able to get a job or financial aid, etc., like my sister did because she wasn't a citizen until in the middle of college and so forth. So because I had the privileged to have an education focusing on all of these things, it made me have the perspective in the back of my mind like, I am a small part of this. No one is going out there and also thinking about these things. So it made me look at Gen Z and how we relate to all this a bit differently than I noticed older generations would.
Yeah, certainly. I think what I start to think about when you say that, and why I asked the question initially too, is that uh, for our parents' generation, right, housing was not this like huge, key, one of a kind issue as it is now, obviously, as the data that we know we're here to talk about and that you write about all the time suggests, and obviously proves true. But like with that rising to the top of every kind of the cultural zeitgeist and the political discussion, you're going to have a lot more people that have an opinion
Mhm.
about the housing crisis. And on one note, like you say, yay, like more people knowing about something is good. The problem is you're having a lot of faith that like the research that people are putting into their opinion on that is of a certain degree and amount. And I think we would obviously say about any issue that that's not going to be the case. So I wonder like how much of this is, obviously you could take like abundance, right? That whole the narrative that is very popular right now, and anything like that that reaches across like a more niche like urbanist community, or like people who are already reading about these things, already read City Lab, already have interest in all this. Like I'm very thinking right now a lot about how to make this conversation, this housing conversation, more like sexy and cool for an audience that isn't necessarily going to want to engage in it other than just saying their opinion about what they heard about BlackRock or the vacancy myth or anything like that. So I'm curious, like, lifetime workshop, I'm sure you've thought of similar things. Like what do you think is a way to go about for folks like us who do want to spread a more holistic message about this, or
Mhm.
to elevate the conversation, we'll say? What's the best way to go about that, do you think?
I think messaging is going to be everything here. And Buffy Wicks, she is legislator in California, has a great quote on this. She said, "Permitting reform is not sexy." And I wrote a piece on a paper that her team did about like their entire infrastructure plan and permitting reform. And I was like, we can make it sexy.
Mm.
Like, this is something we should all care about. And that is why I actually really do love like the abundance agenda of the movement, is because they are allowing us to paint a story where that was before reserved for technocrats, policy analysts, and it wasn't reaching the average person. But if you go out on the street and you see the recent election we just had, people care about how much their housing is going to cost. If you see people who are graduating, they don't want to move into an apartment with 8 people and stay there for the next decade. They don't want to buy a house with their sibling, but that is the outcomes of what they're doing. So in order to stop putting on like these little band-aid reforms, which are, to blame like greedy developers or like evil corporate landlords, which of course are not perfect actors, no one in this world is, but to find root causes and understand that constructive policy is going to able to not make change overnight, but slowly but surely we will now have the to-do list of like, this is what we want to do. I had a piece I wrote last week called like diagnosing the vibe session. I know you had Kyla Scanlon on here before, and I thought this term that she coined way back in like the pandemic days was just perfect for a lot of people who are just going through like a fog of dread where everything just felt so unattainable for them. But then you'd have economists online point to like GDP numbers and say like, the economy's fine, you guys relax. And like people rightfully felt gaslit. And then you have a book come out called Abundance, which is just like diagnosing every little thing wrong in government and implementation and how we have been messing up with high-speed rail, green energy development. And it's like, yeah, we finally, like, we know what is wrong and how to fix it. Like, it is actually insane how it can create such a positive aura or vibe set just by simply diagnosing it. And I made the comparison to, for example, mental health. Like, for our parents, if you discuss like being depressed or anything, like any man would have been like, you're weak, that it does not exist. Like, get over yourself.
Yeah.
But now we have normalized it enough where if you are depressed, we understand it's a neurochemical imbalance. These are the steps that you take to get better. It doesn't make the depression go away, but there is a little safety net there, knowing like, I'm not crazy. It's not just me.
Sure. No, and I'm glad you brought that piece up. That's where I was headed next. With the abundance point, right? Like the word itself, I think when the book first came out, before we had all heard about it tirelessly and countlessly, not tirelessly in a bad way, but just like constantly, I think that word initially sounds so vague, right? And you talked about this in this piece, and I think you mentioned it in a piece you wrote in November too, about housing and talking about the reason why this book and this movement, and I think you were at a conference last week in listening to Derek Thompson talk about this as well, is because it gave this vague conversation specificity. In a lot of what you've been writing long form, I've noticed this theme of specificity that keeps popping up in different ways, that I think you're trying to make this point, at least the way it comes across to me, is that there are all these things happening. Some are successful, some aren't. It seems like the biggest differentiator from what you were arguing is that, look at like Rhode Island's housing bond, which you cited in your piece, I think from November, talking about it as a success and how it was more specific in where the dollars were going to actually be applied and used. This to me, like, this is one of those things when you hear it, you're like, of course, but then it's not done. So like, why, why do you think that is, first of all? And then second of all, like maybe zooming in on what you heard Derek Thompson talk about in referencing this article, and we'll link the article obviously and everything, but if you want to go into it a bit more about kind of what you took away from that and specifically that point on specificity, because I've taken that away from a lot of what you've commentated on recently.
Yeah, it's funny that you're noticing that current theme across my previous pieces, because I'm just putting that together now. It really is a large part of why I've been so like happy like to be like a policy wonk during this time. I remember like going back even back to like my first ever public policy class where I was, a political science major, and I was like, I feel like this is way too vague for me, and we are just reading theory, but like it applies then. I'm not seeing how it's applying now. And I am talking to professors on like public policy 101. Like that is how basic we were discussing it. And I was like, I feel like there's still so much gridlock here where no one is getting anything done. They say they are going to do these things and then they just do nothing because they want to get reelected again. And then I feel like the asshole for going out there and advocating for this person. And prior, like a couple years back, I was working at the Niskanen Center, and this is when they were building out their state capacity team. And I was confused. I wasn't really sure what state capacity meant, but it came about during the time of the pandemic, of when you understood the government's role in crises like this. And it's something Derek Thomas even mentioned for like the LA fires. That was the most like recent crisis that we had where you really needed government intervention to step in. And you notice that when you light a fire under government's ass, they can get shit done. And you're just like, why do we not always do this? Why are we pausing rules for in times of crises and not on the average if we see an ongoing crisis happening all the time with housing, for example? But instead, because people are so angry, politicians will look for reforms that are right in front of their face, which are these like little like band-aid reforms that saying like, you're right, you want affordable housing, we'll get you that. We are going to do a project in San Francisco. It's going to be all affordable housing, and this is going to make everyone happy. And then the process of getting that done is that it's going to cost 10 times the amount than it would for a market house with all these conditions next to it where it'll take forever to even build. And then at the end of the day, there is no progressive outcome. So the fact that we now have a series of different policy advocates from all across the aisle who are looking at how policies are actually delivering outcomes instead of just putting all these tiny little reforms because it's going to subside some fears in the meantime, just got me so entirely excited, which is why like a book like Abundance, even though it's like it's really an Abundance 101 like policy book, it's very surface level, but it does take from like years of a growing movement of many like well-intentioned people seeing all these also well-intentioned laws and how they just don't work in a modernized society anymore.
Right. And yeah, I've seen some criticism from some people that I, follow and respect, talking about how it's not it doesn't go deep enough and doesn't give way to enough of the nuance that goes into policymaking at a certain extent. But I'm like, yeah, but then it's not an accessible book for
Mhm.
the general public, right? Like I think it's done so much to push forward a conversation at a level that I didn't even know like we might be able to have as a general public. Like the people that I've had run in conversations with about that book and its containments are people that I like. It's not a statement about intelligence. Like they're in a completely different world. They work in like an industry that has nothing to do with, say, housing or these issues, and so it's been really cool to see how quickly it's brought people up to speed on a thing that is happening beneath all of our noses and that most of us are complaining about or at least nervous about on a day-to-day basis. So that's been really cool. You talked a bit about the Gen Z kind of split and breakdown, which I think is like something that I think about a lot because we're both on that. I don't even remember exactly how it was framed, but the chart you put in there,
Yeah.
it's the Gen Z kind of 1.0 versus
Yeah,
2.
one and
There it
two.
is.
Which
And
one are you?
I'm one. So
Okay,
I'm like I graduated a year behind you. So
gotcha.
so we're like very much I think I've coached some soccer and dealt with some kids that are not far behind me generally. Like we're in the same generation, but and again, it's not like a statement of better or worse, but like we're very different in terms of like our day-to-day life and how we consume things. And like I'm active on TikTok, but it's not like where I get my baseline for information in life,
That's
right?
scaring me a bit.
Yeah,
Kids are
it's
getting their
crazy.
news all off TikTok. Like I have seen actually an increase. This is a little off topic of
No, go for it.
using TikTok searches like their Google now,
Yes. Yes.
and I would never think of that. And it's like it's just like it amazes me because we're only like a couple of years of difference, but just from like I mean, COVID, like the shift that you see with these younger generations, and it's just like I guess the time I was in grad school where I didn't have time to be like on social media as much as I would have liked, like it just became an entirely new sphere.
Right. No, an example is I was talking to my mom about a supplement the other day that we were
Mhm.
talking about like the virality of, this thing right now. And I couldn't remember like the brand or something. I don't even remember, but I went on TikTok to search just the name of the supplement. And as I was typing it in, like the suggested searches were all like, they were questions about like the science and the validity of
Oh,
the supplement, which is like fair and great. And at first I was like, that's actually kind of cool. I can go get some scientific information. Of course, I click one of them and it's all TikTok shop links, every
yeah.
single video. And I'm like, this is weird because I know from talking to some folks in the 2.0 group, like you said, that's Google now. And
Yeah.
that's a really different dynamic in terms of like where we're coming to the table at. And it's not 2.0's fault, but that's like a really interesting moment to be in where we almost have to like encourage people to Google things.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
I know. It's so funny. It goes from like back when we were in school where our teachers would like yell at us, like, don't use Wikipedia. And now they're just like begging them, like, at least use Spark Notes or Wikipedia, like
Right.
stop using these other avenues to do so. So it is a very funny change. And I do think that is where like a lot of like the split is what we're seeing, because like I just said, like you feel like there is like I don't feel like Gen Z when I am being compared to these people. If anything, I feel like a boomer
Yeah.
compared to them. But it is like how they're able to look at the world around them. And there's something that Rachel Genfaza, she's the creator of the chart, and she has her own blog. I think it's the Up and Up. And she notices that from Gen Z 1.0, we were the group that were attending like the Women's March, like March for Our Lives, and so forth. And it's where you like genuinely believe, like if you pushed institutions far enough, like you could get some change. And while we still feel like a little failed by institutions, is a little bit because we still also went through COVID and all these things, and we
Yeah.
have Trump and all, blah, blah, blah. But Gen Z 2.0 was not, they didn't come to age during that time. They were much younger and they graduated straight in like high school, not college, into the pandemic. And Democrat incumbents were in charge during that time. And so you see the world like just like breaking around you, and then you also see the Biden admin telling you like inflation's fine, everything's okay, and they put out a lot of well-meaning like policies. I think the CHIPS Act is great, even though we might need like little reforms here and there. But it didn't feel like people cared about you specifically, and that is why like we saw like such a large shift in younger voters to right-wing groups, which was just like surprising to me. But like the more I read about it, I was like, I guess like it does make sense if the incumbent is the one who's constantly breaking you down and the candidate was the incumbent's VP. You are going to try and look for someone who comes through like a populist mindset and says like, well, I care about you and I will fix things, because they don't care about you. They care about a larger picture. And because Dems never really focus on the practicality of their programs, it really started to break through and erode that trust they had.
Yeah, I do think there's a metaphor of sorts here, which is like I almost think that a sect of that generation probably didn't like the video they were on in terms of like the
Yeah.
administration of those ways, and it was easy to kind of swipe to the next. And like again, I don't distance myself from them entirely, but like I do think there's an element to this, which is like it is it is sometimes easier to move on to a new thing, and we all
Mhm.
are guilty of this in some respect. It's like when things get hard, that new like project you were going to work on sounds really enticing all of a
Mhm.
sudden. Like you never clean your house until you have like a homework assignment due, and then all of
Oh
a sudden
yeah.
like now I'm in a cleaning mood, you know what I mean? And I think like obviously this is a little bit anecdotal, but I think there's something to be said for like sometimes it's simple as it's not the thing that we have right now, and it's
The grass is
something.
greener. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's tough because I don't know about you, but like when I was in middle school, high school, like rap music was the cool thing, right?
Mhm.
Everybody listened to rap. Like I can remember back in even like second grade, it was like, oh, don't tell my mom what song I'm listening. You know what I mean? And now
Mhm.
like country music has kind of taken that mantle, and I think it's interesting. And the reason I bring this up is I think some of it is just like what becomes too normal, and then like what's the thing that's not that. And I think this like scales up and has implications in a policy and presidential sense too. um and yeah, I always think about that music example of just like for me it was very different than now, where it's like that people now like country, and sure I'm sure there's like an acquired taste, but I think some of it too is just different than what was, and that in itself is enough to like at least make people a little bit more open-minded about trying something entirely different, even if they're not fully informed on what that different thing is. So I don't know. It's
No,
fun
I
to
think
fun to
you
come up
made
with
like a
this.
comparison that I did not think about because I was just assuming because I grew up in New York City that everyone listened to rap, but like everyone does listen.
I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and like is same thing. You know what I mean? Like, and you know, I went to college in Arizona, so I used to think like the country music thing when I went to school, my undergrad was like that. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm in Arizona, but then I realized like it seems like it's everywhere now. And to me, in high school, if you would have said like I'm listening to country music, everyone would have been like, "What are you talking about?" You know what I
no,
mean?
that's exactly how it was when we were in high school as well. Like we listened to Drake then. It was very funny.
And now it's kind of like if you're just like a typical old lefty, it's like boring. That's like the good judgment you
You're
get. And then
discussing
the
the
bad,
counterculture that has taken prevalence with young people now. Yeah, no,
yeah,
I think that is something that I find online quite a bit, and it's why like our policy discussions often become so negative because even if something good does happen, and I was guilty of this when I was younger, but I was like, well, it's not enough. Like
mm,
that means nothing. Like for example, I remember like New York City's like city for yes.
yeah,
City of Yes, I mean, when it was first passed, it went through a lot of discussions and it did get watered down, but it was still the largest housing reform within one package passed in like modern history, which says so much. So I remember I had a tweet out just highlighting like the amount of houses that were happening over the next 10 years and what it was. And just all the comments are like, well, this is nothing. Like this is like what 100 houses per year, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, I I understand that that is the first like comment that people want to make of these things, but you have to realize like 10 years ago, like no one even knew, like I couldn't even say the word YIMBY without anyone, even 10 years ago, I was 16. I wouldn't know what the word YIMBY was. Like
right.
I would have to like have it be spelled out and still like you probably shouldn't say it to the average person. They'll still think you're weird. You should explain to them what like yes in my backyard means. But it is a way more common than it used to be. So I think that's why like more policy communicators should be focusing more on like the positive and why I wrote that recent piece on like diagnosing the vibe session. Like Derek's right. Even though he spent like 200 pages like just saying everything wrong in the country, this just means now we have a to-do list. Like ending it with a positive framing resonates so much more with young people because like no one wants to live in doom and gloom. I understand the algorithm makes it seem that way, but if you get out in person, you have conversations like these, even if me and you were on opposite ends of like the aisle when it came to policies, like I would like to think in good faith that we would just have a conversation of how we can find commonalities and how we move forward from there. And it's just like it's more of a cultural understanding of how you look at the younger generation instead of just assuming that everyone wants to be negative all of the time.
Right. No, it's one of those things where and it's almost like honestly in like the urbanism space we talk about how things lack of choice gets misconstrued as like demand for something.
Mhm,
So we take this as like, oh, everyone in the United States owns a car. So that means people want to drive. And it's like, well, no, they don't have an option. Like if they had the choice, the data suggests and it in both a, you know, how people would spend their money, their time, etc., that they would not choose that thing. So
mhm.
sometimes taking something as just like a face value signal is a disingenuous way to look at something like that. And I don't know. I just think that's a very like important thing to remember is we have to provide an alternative to negativity, and then we can really see like a means test. And I'm sure somebody out there will say, well, they've done, you know, A/B tests with titles of articles and negative ones win. But I think what you're talking about and what I would agree with is like bigger conversations, larger, you know, packages of policy or like initiatives. I do think most people would prefer like solutions as opposed to like a package that creates problems or just states them. I think
Yeah,
that's pretty obvious, but it seems like, you know, something's missing there in our link of translating that into the real world. So I don't
no,
know.
and I agree, but it's also like it is like hard to do so when you are like we talked at the beginning of this when you're living in like a policy and political world where there's just so much negative news being thrown at you all the time. Like as someone who's very attuned to this, you want to like constantly write about like, hey, this is what they're doing. Like make sure we're all aware about this. But I write the rebuild with my colleague Gary Winslet. He is he's a great academic and someone who has been in the political economy and trade sphere for I want to say like a decade now. So he is just like an immense amount of experience. And something we do at the Rebuild is, one, we started this because we realized like Democrats did lose like this the cost of living issue. They realized that they were focused on all these big bright ideas, but they weren't delivering. So it made everyone to be a bit so negative on it. So we wanted to focus on like not even like larger conversations happening with the Trump administration, how it relates to the average person's like cost of living, but even like small little niche things that like we might not have heard of. Like for example, I've talked about this before, but Gary wrote a piece on sunscreen, and I always tell that piece about people. They think it's like so small and minuscule, and I'm like, did you know we like regulate sunscreen as like a medical product instead of a cosmetic product, while other countries such as like Korea do it as a cosmetic process. So they have been able to innovate more to make it cheaper, and they just have better sunscreen from us. And the end of that is that we are going to like go online and order from a different country instead of just like making sunscreen better here. Just small little things like that that could make someone's life better. Just like sunscreen is really expensive. Have you gone
Yeah.
into CVS? So like
Not the cheapest thing.
so focusing on like small things like that to make someone's life better, it allows you to bring things down to earth and understand like policy is not like this large thing that we're never going to be able to like grapple and get a hold of. It's first defining what the actual problem is and finding the specific avenue to help solve that root issue.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you have any, like, this just comes to mind here. Do you have any examples of whether it's a specific policy or maybe the rollout or the storytelling that coincided with the policy that you think is like a good precedent example for people that are either trying to, write and push forward new initiatives, or that are just trying to help be a public steward of information so that more people can fully understand something pertaining to housing or transportation or infrastructure? Folks listening to this show, we have a lot of people that want to get involved in their local communities and like how to, make things in the built environment more walkable or more transit oriented, or want to help create third places that their community and their neighbors can come together in, but they don't know how. I think like all of us, to an extent, we don't really know in like the real world. Like we get this whole like online how to do things now in terms of like putting things out there, but it's harder to like go down the street with your neighbor and create something that deals with policy and implications in like a very built sense. Do you have any good examples of something that you think would be a good place? Like I mentioned the Rhode Island one earlier, which we'll definitely link below, the housing bond that you talked about in one of your pieces. And I like looking into that a bit more and how they rolled that out and being very clear about, where the dollars would go and such. Is there anything else that comes to mind of like certain things that would be good precedents for folks?
Do you mean policy initiatives that are doing well now, or different avenues for younger people to enter this space? Because those could be like two different
I would say the
answers.
first one first, but if you got a good one for that second one, that's a good question as well. So let's hit them both.
I would follow along for a lot of the things Governor Shapiro is doing. For example, they have like this new energy task force where they're looking to get state officials to design just one streamlined like avenue of how we are going to move forward with a clean energy projects, infrastructure, instead of leaving it to the localities, which end up going through a bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is when you have several little people who can say no at any moment, and then now you have all of these projects that don't get pushed through. So the fact I always joke like Governor Shapiro is like the abundance like governor. He's the abundance politician to me right now, by implementing programs like this, and also like very small things such as cutting the time for people to get like occupational licenses for like barbers or like hairstylists, or if you want to open a small business or something, if you have to wait like for months to be able to open your business, like you're just like, some people who don't have the resources to do so are going to continue working under someone and won't take the avenue to become the entrepreneur that could help them with upward mobility. So I think finding like the small wins there, and also like giving positive feedback to it online or whatever you can. Like I don't think people understand like politicians do not get positive feedback ever. So I think it's great when we allow them to know like this is exactly what people are looking for. They want their daily lives to become easier. We want to see these big projects that we put so much money in actually do something with it. So the fact that you want to create an entire board that is going to instead have a clear direction and an authoritative power and say like this is how it is going to happen. We want to make sure environmental protections are there. We'll always keep it that. We want it to only be or environmental concerns. We're not going to take one large like NEPA and put that across the entire project and say like, actually, we can't do it because someone said we might get sued if and when this very imaginable thing might happen.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's Shapiro is someone that we've talked about a bit on the show before in terms of some good examples happening there, and I think that you bring up a great point. And like I talked to someone in Charlotte a couple weeks ago about, or Clayton Sealy. I don't know why I said someone, but I talked to Clayton Sealy in Charlotte a couple weeks ago, who local leader there, and just kind of got into that power conversation about politicians of like is this understanding and narrative, or misunderstanding and narrative out there that, everyone who goes into civic and public service has this like agenda for themselves. And so you
Mhm.
bring up a great point, is like, that's not the case when you meet some of these people, I think. And particularly,
A
when you
lot of us
start to talk.
are.
Yeah, exactly. And it is really important to like take a sec to acknowledge the positive stuff as well. It's the same thing, like people at restaurants only leave Yelp reviews when like they had a bad
Yeah.
experience a lot of times. It's a similar type of thing. And I think it is important to celebrate the incremental wins that are happening in this country. And we try to do that here with like being an optimistic conversation about like grassroots urban design or planning that's happening. But it can get tough, obviously. But I do think you bring up like a really key point in that, which is like, let's take a sec and make sure in our local communities that we build upon momentum that is happening, even if 99% of things we perceive as bad. Look at that 1%. How did it work? How was it able to be passed or pushed forward in the way that it was? How can you strip that back and then apply the logic elsewhere? So it's a great point.
I
Thanks for
also
bringing
think
that up.
a lot of this like is like policy communicators should hold themselves responsible in where they shouldn't ever like blame voters or blame constituents. It's like, well, we did all these good things, you guys just never like listened to us. Like, so you need to make it accessible and meet people where they are. If they are online on Twitter, like do a thread, do a great infographic that's not just a bunch of words on a like image, like actually be able to like talk it through and use like accessible language, or go on podcasts with other people. Like there was the whole joke with like Democrats, like a liberal Joe Rogan, like, no, just go on the existing media spheres and talk to people, and like they'll listen. I forgot who it was exactly. There was it was Andrew Scholes, who's
Yeah.
that famous comedian, and there was some politician who went there and he was like, oh, I'm a progressive now. I think it was like maybe Pete Buttigieg or something who went on there, and it just shows like speaking to people one-on-one on like the different avenues that people are like accessing their news is going to change the narrative quite a bit. So it's like it's a push and pull. Like unless you're out there like saying like we are doing these positive things and this is how it is helping people, then people are not going to hear it.
Right. Yeah. And those shows, like, I think what people get so wrong is like people aren't going there to listen to political conversations. It just happens to have a few dashes of things that come through and then direct you maybe in a certain way. But it's like, I listen to some of those podcasts because I think
Yeah,
they're funny. You
they're
know what I
fun.
mean? Like, but again, it's like, I don't only listen, listen to those, and they're
No, of
not my
course.
political influence. But I think that's like an important distinction, because I do think a lot of people on the left side of the conversation act as if like people are going to listen to the flagrant podcast to get their politics. And I don't think that's like the conscious mindset going into that listening experience, as talk about there. And I think like it's an important thing to understand that people on the left can also go into those spaces. They are not
Yeah.
hostile. They're actually usually pretty friendly and welcoming to guests, it seems, in terms of, like the different types of people that go on those shows. And so I think it's just a mistake to shun any sort of media in any way, especially like we talked about in this day and age with Gen Z 2.0, coming into the voting block and
No, for
receiving
sure. And
messages how they do.
especially with something like urban planning and housing, where it is so convoluted and like it can be quite technocratic. But then at the end of the day, like you have the same end result where people are upset that they can't reach these goals. Like, for example, there was some economist who came out today. The headline was just terrible, and he was like, "The one like advice I can give to homeowners, like hold on to it forever." And it's like, that's the whole issue. We have such limited supply in housing, and then you have this older generation who says to hold on to the housing. It's like, but what about people who are coming into the market where they just can't feel like they can never afford it? And that's not the root cause. It is a symptom of having a housing undersupply crisis. But instead, you were going to see that and be like, it is all their fault. That's wrong. and now you have now you have a villain, and you're not going to look further into it because why should you? You have a job.
Right. Yeah, it's once I know we talk about a lot on here, like the same place that you worked your whole life to move to is now the place that you so quickly forgot how that felt to want to be in a neighborhood or want to be somewhere else because you used to be that person that wasn't there. Now, I mean, obviously, this is not rocket science, but it all kind of stems back to it's really tough having something that for a large majority of the population is like livelihood and for the rest is a financial instrument. Like that is not a great recipe for any singular thing, in this case housing in the country, but like it's really hard to have that a singular asset be and constitute both of those realities for different groups of the population. It's a no wonder we don't agree on a lot of things. Like it's almost more miraculous that we get along as well as we do sometimes. I know that's probably not a popular opinion right now, but it's like I mean, it's hard to structurally look at that. And so I guess what that all comes back to too is like we can do a lot in terms of humanity and talking to each other, but there is policy at the end of the day. Like we do need to go back to changing regulation and how these things can happen or can't happen, because at the end of the day, human beings are human beings. And I think a lot of us on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the age spectrum, it's like we are very quick to judge the other group. And then when we get there to that place in life, we are very similar to them mentality
Yeah, it's
wise.
like the old age saying like, "Oh, you'll be conservative when you're older," and
Yeah.
things like that. Because like you know, it's why like immigrants are like more conservative than people who are like younger, like progressive, because like they came here and they fought through a very hard immigration process to get here, and now they're like, I can't look out for anyone else but me and my own because this process was so hard and difficult. And when you are viewing things from like a zero sum scarcity mindset, it is very easy to think like we can't give housing to anyone else. We have to keep it landlocked only for us. And we cannot allow any, whether it is public or private, to build anything outside of that because it is only going to harm the people here who worked so hard to get here. There's a quote that I love. It's by William J. Howell, Terry M.O., and he says, populists don't just feed on socioeconomic discontent, they feed on ineffective government. And their great appeal is that they claim to replace it with a government that is effective through their own autocratic power. And I think that is something that is very resonant to what we are going through. And we saw this even during the campaign where JD Vance said in his debate to Tim Walz saying like 25 million illegal immigrants are stealing your homes. That is why you can't get housing. And it's like, oh my God, if you deported every single immigrant tomorrow, as we said, the housing market would crash even harder than what the tariffs are doing to it now. It is just not the case, but it is easy rhetoric to hold on to when you feel like you're on a sinking ship.
Yes, and it relies on people. It leans into people knowing how to do like addition, I guess, and subtract. Or they're like
Yeah.
this many homes, people, more people equals. You know what I mean? And it's like that you're not taking into account the inputs and you're not taking into account all the other things that go into the housing supply. And as someone who lives about 45 minutes away from Springfield, Ohio, well, they got quite a bit wrong during that time in the cultural narrative surrounding some of these places and the housing crisis that exists in them. So it's a whole thing, obviously, and I don't know. We're all chipping away at it, I guess, and I don't really know exactly what it's going to look like ultimately. But I am curious, like you've lived in DC, right? And in New York City, and now you're out in California and Los Angeles. I'm always curious, people we have on the show, why have you chosen to live in the places that you have? I think this is like such a interesting thing personally to me, because I'm on the show talking about places and cities and like the sorts of places that are really strong for where people want to live their life and grow a family and such. I'm just this one's just pure curiosity from my end. Like, what about the places that you've chosen to live has kind of driven you to be excited about building in that spot?
Yeah. So I again grew up in New York City, so that's why I was there. I grew up in Queens. I grew up in like the very like middle of Queens, so there wasn't really any train. So when I went to college at Hunter, that was all the way on the Upper East Side. The commute ended up being like an hour and a half at times. That's why people in New York, like in the outer boroughs, they call it the city. Like it is far. They don't
Right.
realize that. So I lived on the almost Harlem Upper East Side for a little bit, and then I was downtown. And from there, since I graduated 2020, I was home because of the pandemic for a little bit, and I was just applying like a crazy person. Like I feel for the graduates now, because I'm sure now is just as terrible of a job market as it was when I graduated. So I took the first fellowship that I felt aligned with what I wanted to do, and that took me to DC. Even if I didn't really have to be there, I thought it would be a better position than staying at my parents' house because I just wanted to get out of there. I lived in just about every corner of DC in like the 4-ish years I was there. Noma, which is north of something, was my favorite part just because it was really close to the train station. It was so walkable and it was just a homier feel to it. It almost reminded me of parts of Brooklyn, which felt like home to me. And I live in LA now just because my husband is an entertainment lawyer. So that is why we're over here. But when it comes to buying a house, um, it's probably going to be so long before we even have that conversation because as you know, the housing, I look at it all the time. The housing market in LA is not one to fuck around with.
Nope.
And I think we would probably move either back to the East Coast or outside of the city a
I
little
see.
bit. I'm not too sure. It's so far in the future.
I
But like
know.
really just jobs have always like taken me where
Yeah,
I live. And I feel like
totally.
such a coastal elitist when I list the places that I've lived because I've only lived in cities.
So it's actually interesting because this is kind of like where my brain was going. Is
Yeah.
does that ever create like an interesting uh thing for you when you're talking about like something that is nationwide, or maybe do you ever get comments about that, like you don't understand what life's like here in Ohio? Speaking as someone who's sitting in Ohio right
Yes.
now, like I've always thought I've lived in like Arizona, Dallas, like all these places that I didn't necessarily love in the urban design sense that I do some of the East Coast cities, but like I always thought that it helped like the narrative side a little bit. That could just be overthinking entirely, but I'm just curious if it ever like causes issues in terms of when you're trying to communicate with certain audiences. Is it ever a barrier?
No, I understand, and that is why I'm so glad I have my co-writer Gary because he is from the rural like Midwest, so he is able to check us. And anytime we have to write about like especially when it comes to like healthcare access is a big thing that we are focusing on right now there. So I want to make sure that I am talking to someone who has personal experience. My husband's also from Tennessee, so I've got to visit Cleveland and Chattanooga, Tennessee, quite a bit. And also, my parents are from Morocco, so like as a kid, I would get shipped off to like a farm in literally North Africa for months at a time. So like I know life outside of the city,
Yeah.
but I understand and recognize like it's a very unique experience to be a kid in Queens. Like we would sit on stoops and my one of my best friends, her parents were divorced and her dad was all the way like out in like deep Long Island. And she'd be like, we are so lucky that like we're having this conversation at age 12 that we live here. Like it's so much easier to hang out with like your friends. Like I could just walk 2 blocks down as a kid in middle school and go sit on the stoop and it is perfectly safe to do so. I didn't learn how to drive until moving to LA. At the age of 25, I got my license. Like
This is
there's
my favorite thing you've said the whole episode.
I like I am just like I'm so incredibly lucky to have had those experiences. And it's why like when I discuss like people don't understand like walkable communities will make your life like so much better. And I'm not saying everything should be a city. Some people do want to have like a big backyard and space and privacy. I understand that, but like man, you're gonna want to be at least like a 15-minute drive away from like a downtown strip. It will make your life so much easier.
Yeah, and it also helps in times of crisis when you need like healthcare or anything that
Yeah, you want to talk about
any
healthcare deserts, food deserts, like all these things.
job markets, dating and mating, prospects, basically everything in
Completely.
your life. And I'm not like, I totally get that people want to live in non-city context. My argument is always sprawl kills every other alternative lifestyle.
Yeah.
If you want to live on a farm, we're on the same page, like we're on the same side of this equation. And it makes me pumped to hear. I'm fascinated with like New York City childhoods because I think I would have loved it. And I think about a lot like raising kids there would be awesome
No, I
if
was like 8 to 11
asterisks.
on the
Yeah,
6 train. Like it
yeah,
you are such an adult at such a young age. I've never actually realized it until when I came down for my fellowship where I was like joking around. I was like, DC is the South. We are in Virginia, this is the South. And I noticed like a maturity gap with other people who were like even a
oh
couple years older than me. And I was like, wow, the city really throws you to the wolves. Like
yeah,
I also like because I went to college in the city, I didn't have like the frat or Greek life or anything. I was a bartender and a server, so I was always talking with people who were like in their 30s and 40s as if we
yeah.
were like the same age. So I never was around like that many people my own age.
Yes. No, it's like such a, I don't know. Every time I'm in New York, I just have such a hope for humanity. Like it's such a beautiful thing, the amount of people that are, like
I
you
wish they
said,
built more there.
yeah, like learning from each other practically
Yeah.
through like just living life. Like it's not it's learning in a different way, and I think it's so beautiful to think about like a child having to, on a very basic sense, like memorize a transit map or understand, surroundings, spatial awareness, crossing a street. Like it's all the
Mhm.
things that I have like thought about for raising my kids, of like these are the things I'm going to arrange, because I think it's like the way to teach children, and every kid that grows up in New York gets it to a
I
certain
know
extent.
it worries me about like the idea of raising a kid in LA.
Yeah.
They're gonna grow up with so much joy. I hate that.
Yeah.
Like dread beat into you at age 5.
Oh, yeah, it's probably it probably doesn't feel that way when you are when you are the kid, but I guess there's probably some nuance here. Not everybody's experiencing that the same way, but I get your point. I get what you're alluding to.
I want everyone to be bitter about. I spent like the whole 45 minutes like about positivity and policy. And I'm like, I'm
This explains it though. This is where you're letting out this is where you're letting out the negativity so you can
no, but
be
it is true, and
positive.
this is why like I again like I feel like my brain broke in college when I was like learning more about like how policy itself worked because I was just so angry about
Uh,
everything, and it's just like in specificity. Like when I realized like what actually it was, I just felt like determined to learn more
mm,
about it. I was like,
I see.
okay, now I have like an action plan. Like this is what we have to do instead of me just like shouting to the void.
Oh, yeah. So it gave you a channel for your
Yeah, it
for your
channeled my
thoughts, your
anger.
busy mind. Yeah. Which is very helpful. We all need that in one case or another. Well, no, that's just interesting. I'm always curious why people choose to live in the spots that they do, and it'll be interesting to see where you choose where you choose to go
I
next.
don't know. I go back and forth. Like we just got married like a month ago, so we're not even like thinking of like planning of like where like we would put our roots down. But for now, we're in LA. I don't mind it at all. The place that we have is much larger than we would be able to have and afford in LA.
Mhm.
Like I live in like I guess it's like a duplex type like condo type thing with like you can even see like a little like tiny rooftop. In New York, I can't even tell you how much this would cost. I would have to be on like Forbes 30 under 30 and like a millionaire to afford this place. And that is just like not the case here. So that's something to consider.
It's true, but that place in New York would be insanely awesome
And
if
I
you
could walk
were
down the
on.
street and I could just get my bagel and my coffee instead of
See.
having to get into a car to go somewhere. Yeah.
See. But there goes back to the abundance affordability question. And how do we get more people access to those neighborhoods? That's what we're trying to do in an interesting way. It's what you're also,
Your transit.
hey, yeah, you're being a leading voice on in a different way. I love having people on the show that aren't like directly talking about urban design and planning, but their work like absolutely impacts it day to day. Going back to the generalism point, like everything is intertwined in this sense, and I think that it's like a really cool perspective. And I hope that folks listening to this show go and dive into the work that you're doing, because I think it does inform a lot of what folks are hearing me have conversations with others on the show about. And it's something that we should go upstream to spend a little more time on, I think, examining. So the last question that we ask everybody on the show, um, it's called good traffic. We talk a lot about, again, transportation, urban design, planning, all the things we've chatted about today too. But out of all the places you've ever lived, you alluded to this a little bit ago. What's been the best and your favorite commute that you've ever had?
um, I'll give you my worst commute actually.
Yeah, let's go back on the negativity. Let's keep it rolling.
So it was back when I lived in the dorms. It was downtown, and I took the 6 train to go all the way up. I I swear, I think these people were messing with me. At like the same time I needed to get to my 8 a.m., there was a mariachi band that would come at 7 a.m. onto one of the cars and just play mariachi music at like the crack of dawn. And it just gave me a headache every time. They were so loud. Like it was an entire band. It's like if this was at like 5, 6
Yeah.
p.m. and I'm like, okay, I'm awake, I've had my coffee. I'm like, love New York City. The vibes are beautiful. But if I'm like commuting to my 8 a.m. class, I would try to like switch carts every time. And it was like a joke. I would tell my friends, like, they're on my cart again. It
They're
happened.
following you. This was every day?
It was every time I had my 8 a.m., which was like twice a week. I
Interesting.
think they were there every day because my friends, like, we all knew, like, they all knew who I was talking about. I don't know if they still do it. This was again back in like the 2018, 2019 type thing.
Huh, that is wild. I mean,
It's memorable.
that would be some people's probably favorite commute, but it sounds your
Again, if
least
it was
favorite one.
like a weekend thing, I think it would be a hilarious
Yeah.
thing to like wherever you're going to, but like you're just like you're an entitled college student going to your 8 a.m. You're tired. I worked
Yeah.
the night before.
Context matters. Yeah, they
Yeah.
should have they should have thought about it. They probably would have had a, different audience too, a more excited audience to tip or do whatever it is that they were trying to get them to. Do you have a favorite one also, or we
Just
just
anything that allowed me to walk.
Hmm.
Back when I lived in Noma, my previous job was in DC. It was like in the CNN building.
Oh,
So
nice.
I always thought it was so cool. Like one time I like on like my second week, like Wolf Blitzer was like in the same like elevator as me, and I was still very new to DC, so I felt very cool about it. But the fact that I was able to walk to work and walk home is just like yeah, especially
Yeah.
looking back now, like LA is just especially where I live is not so walkable. Anywhere I would have to commute now would be a car. So I just look back at those times as like, oh, miss walking.
There's nothing like it, honestly. That we can keep technologically innovating in a billion different ways. Sometimes simplicity is the best innovation when we find something that works, and that's why we will continue to preach the walkability gospel on this show. Well, Tahra, thanks so much for your time today. This has been super fun, and glad to have you on the show. Hopefully, we can have you back soon as you keep writing and keep putting some great stuff out into the world pertaining to housing and other similar and comparable and exciting and very relevant conversations and issues that are right on the top of everybody's docket in this crazy time in 2025. But it's great to have Gen Z perspectives on the show too. A lot of our listeners are Gen Z, so hopefully both 1 and 2.0. So hopefully they both are happy with what we talked
We need
about.
more Gen Z in urban planning.
Yes, exactly. We do,
Make
and
urban
hopefully
planning sexy.
there we go. That we're gonna clip that. We're gonna clip that, and also hopefully to those 2.0s, we didn't sound like we were too old. Get off our lawn.
We just need to work
Else.
better to give them a future that they deserve.
See, there we go. We're on your side, 2.0. So I'm just going to keep referring to them as that. Well, thanks so much. It's been super fun to have you.
Thank you.